so'z navbatini mamnuniyat bilan men Carmela xonimga bermoqchiman.
Thank you, Yildiz, for that question. So I will, if I may deviate a little bit to answer your question. So I covered the Marawi siege in the Philippines. Was when the sympathizers of the ISIS attacked the city of Marawi, laid siege to the city of Marawi over 5 months. And this was massive destruction of the city proper of Marawi. And there have been complaints against government actions, against military action. I think what enabled us journalists to investigate what was going on there was a culture of conversations. I was a member. I think what helped me a lot, because I was a member of the beat of the military. That means I have direct access to generals, and I have been covering previous issues in the past. So there is already that familiarity. And I think that's important as we have our conversations about problems. I've had disputes with generals myself about my coverage of other issues, and we talk about it openly so that I hear their points, I raise my points, and we come to an agreement on how best to handle future situations. And so I think when I did the Marawi siege, we were able to talk to citizens, to the local government officials, to the military, and we're talking about differences of opinions between national governments and local governments. So I think when we talk about corruption, and when we talk about disasters, when we talk about conflicts, it's always about looking at the holistic perspective. And we apply this with any topic that we cover, whether it's corruption, disaster, conflict, because we all have opinions. We all are stakeholders in all of these issues, and it's very important to listen to everybody. And today we had very rich discussions about the way we cover corruption, and we're already hearing some complaints there, some suggestions there. These conversations are very important because as stakeholders, we need to be able to hear and understand where each other is coming from, because it's only through conversations like this that we can come together to come up with solutions that may not be 100% acceptable to one party or another, but the important thing is for us to come together and come with possible ways forward that is in a way agreeable to everybody, maybe 80%, 70%, because I don't think we can impose solutions coming from one side. So I think we should all have that kind of mindset to understand where everyone is coming from, and perhaps, and I will share later a few examples on how we are trying to do this with our anti-corruption work. Thank you for that question, Yildiz. I'm here, and it's truly an honor for the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism to be here at the Tashkent International Media Forum. It's been such a rich discussion. I think it's been repeated throughout the day that sometimes, you think these issues are topics of common sense, that we should know how we should address such issues. But then when we come together like this, there are differences of opinions, and that's why it's always important to have conversations like this. So we thank the government of Uzbekistan for giving us the stage, and also truly honored to be sharing this session with distinguished colleagues, fellow investigative journalists. I also want to thank the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime for a very meaningful partnership with the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism. What I want to talk about today is our work with the Journalists Against Corruption. With support from UNODC, we formed this network of investigative journalists in Southeast Asia, Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Timor-Leste, Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, Vietnam, Thailand. So 9 countries, we have over 40 members, all investigative journalists. And what we want to do precisely is to produce quality investigative journalism, because there are so many challenges, and we've discussed it throughout the day. But we realize the power of the network to be able to work together to produce quality investigative reports on corruption. Because increasingly in Southeast Asia, we know that corruption is increasingly becoming transnational. We're talking about money laundering here. We're talking about bribery. We're talking about procurement. So the challenges can be common. There's also a lot of issues discussed today. It's not just, number one is the recognition that we need to produce quality investigative reports on corruption. The quality has to be so high precisely so that it cannot be questioned. So when we put forward an investigation, everybody will be convinced who is responsible, who is accountable, and from that report, we can move forward to address the issues. But we all work in the anti-corruption space. It's easier said than done, right? We talk about improving the quality of reporting of investigative journalists. We all aspire for this, but we need to set up mechanism. There are requirements that need to be in place for us to be able to do this. And this has happened. For PCIJ, for example, we've produced investigative reports that have prompted court cases against government officials because the evidence is so strong, and most of this data would be coming from the government itself, cooperation with government. Because of our access to data, we're able to produce quality investigative reports that have led to government investigations. Senate hearings, for example, we've produced reports that would lead to Senate investigations and congressional investigations, and I think I will highlight here the important follow-up mechanism, not just for the anti-corruption agencies investigating corruption cases, but also for the reports that investigative journalists produced in the Philippines. There's also a lot of investigations that originate from investigations that investigative journalists do. And I think also the journalists against corruption, because the corruption schemes are so complex, we really need to team together to be able to cover these issues better. So right now, with the Journalists Against Corruption, we are already working to collaborate on investigative reports. One big issue in the Philippines currently, for example, is online scams. And anyone following Southeast Asia, this is happening in the Philippines, in Myanmar, and Cambodia. And these international syndicates are moving from one country to another. And these international syndicates do not operate in a silo. Usually, they get protection from government officials. So this is when bribery happens or money laundering is allowed. So these are the kinds of corruption forms that we are investigating that require the cooperation among journalists in the region. So JAC was formed with support from the UNODC. It's really out of necessity because increasingly in Southeast Asia, there's so many challenges for journalists to operate. We've discussed, for example, technology. Social media is just one that has upended our operations, right? I mean, there's still artificial intelligence, which is a different topic altogether. And then, let me phrase it this way. Erratic behaviors from government, specifically in Southeast Asia, have been very problematic for us journalists. Some can be repressive, some are antagonistic. And we have to recognize that some issues are valid, but some are not. But the important thing is for us journalists to be able to recognize which issues are valid and which issues are not, so that we can respond to them accordingly. And this again goes back to the importance of Journalists Against Corruption as a network, because we require continuous conversations about very specific issues, because solutions are not often black and white. It depends on the specificities of a particular case. For example, also during the Marawi siege, because you mentioned about it, there was a time during Marawi siege when, so it's a siege, and then the military units will clear blocks after blocks. And so they will declare that perhaps half of the city has been cleared of the militants. But there was a time they would not allow journalists to enter what areas that are supposedly clear. For us, we want to show government operations, because later on it would become so clear that the city was, there was so much airstrike, some say are not justified, that have ruined the entire city. Because they don't allow journalists to go to these areas, we are not able to report to the residents what have become of their homes. And then it took a lot of protesting on the part of the Filipino journalists. In fact, we had to fight over Viber group. You know, we usually maintain chat groups with our sources, right? And we had to fight with our sources just to get access to these areas. And as soon as we got access to these areas, it was only possible because we worked together. And again, it's not about imposing ourselves, imposing our rights, that we need to be able to go here, we need to be able to do this. It's a product of conversations among journalists. How far do we push our rights? Because we want to be also realistic. Because again, in Southeast Asia specifically, countries have very different laws. And we need to be familiar with how different countries operate or how different militaries operate. It's always taking advantage of openings and opportunities so that we are able to practice our rights as journalists. And ultimately, we always have to go back to the essence of our panel, right? Is what is the role of investigative journalists? We talk a lot about challenges and technologies changing, for example, different behaviors from governments. We always need to take advantage of openings like conferences like today, because these conversations allow us to discuss possible solutions to our challenges. But for journalists, the challenges can change. It might not be social media in the future. It might not be repression in the future. But our role is constant. It never changes. It is to perform the watchdog role of journalists. It is to take power to account. It is to inform the public so that they know what is happening in our societies. We have to keep them informed so they can participate effectively in democratic processes, so they know. Our conversation, in fact, we're so obsessed with elections because we think it's a most important exercise of democracy, that everything we do, all of our coverage after an elections and until the elections is to show whether a public official is deserving to be elected or not. Because that essentially dictates the quality of lives of the public. If we elect good people in government, we will get good services. So I think we always go back to that role, that the challenges may be different, but our role is always constant. And I think that's our North Star, that we shouldn't be distracted by, we can be distracted by so many issues, we need to address them, but we always go back that in every intervention we make, in every innovation that we introduce, we always go back to our role, that we are representing the interest of the public. At the end of the day, when we face powerful people, we represent the interests of the public and we report on their issues so that the powerful people can listen to the voice of the public. I think we always go back to that. Whenever we choose what investigative report to pursue, for example, we always go back to that question. How does it serve public interest? And because of that, I'd like to share some discussions within the network of the Journalists Against Corruption. How can governments, for example, and like-minded allies in the civil society, in the international organizations, support us journalists in our effort to produce quality journalism? Number one, I think we can only produce quality journalism if we have data, right? I mean, we can only analyze what is happening if we have reliable data. I think that's the very foundation of the work of every investigative journalist. We need to have access to data, and we need to have the freedom to do our jobs and publish the stories that we need to publish. I think those are the fundamentals. And some of this, I wrote 5 issues where we can get support from our allies. This has already been discussed at length, also by Farouk, is resources. I think we talk a lot about so many issues, but bottom line, in the Philippines, in Southeast Asia, it all boils down to resources. We need to give investigative teams ample time and resources to pursue investigations. When funders, for example, approach us at PCIJ and ask us about our own investigations. Investigations can run through, I mean, Farouk was talking about 2 weeks, but for very big investigations, for PCIJ, it can go through 6 months. And sometimes we ask for a minimum budget of $6,000, and that's a minimum because acquiring documents is already expensive. Even government documents can be expensive. Traveling to do field work is very expensive. And it takes time to access data. So I think let's not forget that the reason it's difficult to produce investigative journalism because sometimes there's not enough support from organizations themselves because it costs too much. So I think that's one. Number two, we talked also a lot about capacity building. Corruption schemes are so complex these days. We talk about bribery, money laundering, moving money from one country to another. Even journalists need to understand how these funds move. And we can rely on our partners, our experts. We talked a lot about cooperation between civil society, international organizations, and even government instrumentalities like anti-corruption agency. We need to be able to have this training sessions and workshops so that we can understand how processes work. And again, we talk a lot about the need for collaboration regionally in Southeast Asia, but even that requires understanding of how different laws operate in different countries. Corruption can involve so many jurisdictions, but we need the capacity to be able to understand what is legal, what is not legal. The other challenge, in fact, is the way corruption operates within legal mechanisms, right? And I think often we have those frustrations that we know something wrong is happening, but then the lawyer will always say it happens within legal mechanisms. So I think that's also a challenge. We're finding out that is common in the region. That's why among us journalists, we've come up with terminologies to use. If we cannot use corruption to identify a particular act, can we use conflict of interest? Can we use nepotism? So these are the conversations we're having within Journalists Against Corruption. It's using also the correct allegation when we write our stories. Even to say one person is a close associate of an alleged, of a suspect, for example, we need to discuss this with lawyers, and I think that's one big point also. We don't just require lawyers when we face possible cases. Our stories need to be run through lawyers before they are published, because as you know, in the Philippines, there's been a culture of filing cases against journalists, so we need to put in place protection mechanisms like this. Maybe to wrap up, I think I want to talk about how else, I want to highlight how the government can help support our work. Number one is through laws. We've talked about it a lot: freedom of information, protecting freedom of the press, freedom of speech. We also need to be able to explain to the bureaucracy how these laws are exercised. Because what we discovered in the Philippines, for example, is the law is clear that we should have access to data, for example, but the bureaucracy doesn't know which data can be accessible, which data is not accessible. And sometimes it revolves around discussions on data privacy and national security laws. And there will be agencies that will flat out deny access on the basis of data privacy or national security. I think conversations need to be had so that it's not a blanket denial of access to documents. The other thing is anti-corruption agencies. For us, we found that it works well when journalists and anti-corruption agencies have a good working relationship. And by good working relationship, we mean access to data. It always goes to access to data. Often, government investigations happen behind closed doors. But what kinds of data can be made available so that, precisely as Farouk discussed, the public may not be so interested on a topic today, but with a dogged reporting from investigative journalists, the public can understand why a particular issue, such as the pollution, is very important to the quality of lives of the people. I think access is always paramount. We don't always ask for complete access. But I think there should be clarity in terms of rules. If we are not given access to a particular set of data, it will help if it is explained to journalists why. I think it has to be clear so that the rules are not arbitrary. What types of documents should be granted as a routine? Like, let's not, because sometimes in the Philippines, government agencies will write back to us and ask us to justify why we need particular sets of data. I think the release of particular data, if it doesn't involve clear national interest or national security or data privacy, should be routine. And then to wrap up, I think it's important also to leverage because we talk about the whole day about collaboration between journalists, civil society, local governments, and also international organizations. It's to leverage the expertise of everyone. Like, we like to be open to working with all the sectors, but it should be clear to everyone what our different roles are. Very quickly, I'll share, for example, there was an initial idea to put together civil society and journalists in one anti-corruption group. So together we can fight corruption. But we had to oppose this because there are sets of actions that civil society can do, but journalists cannot. And one example, for example, is maybe some civil society organizations may be more inclined to call for the resignation of a particular corrupt official, but as journalists, we shouldn't be like calling for resignation of particular government officials. So I think it's very important for also to work together while at the same time recognizing our different roles and respecting our different roles in government, in civil society, the international organizations, and journalists. I think I've run out of time. I'm happy to take questions later.
Katta rahmat, Carmela xonim, juda to'g'ri aytdingiz.